Hello, my name is Bayley Sandy. I am the opinion editor with The Emerald, and today I am joined by Republican congressional candidate, Mr. Art Robinson. Thank you, Mr. Robinson, for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
So if elected to Congress, what would be your top priorities?
Top priority is jobs, because if we can't be prosperous, we can't solve the other problems. Second priority is education, because we're not well educated, we can't address the problems. And the third is political reform, because we're in a lot of trouble, and I think we got there partly because of some of the inconsistencies in our political system.
So students continue to be faced with high loan costs and really raising tuition costs. If elected, what would you do to combat this issue and really help students out?
Well, first, in the situation they're in, you have to loan them money. And since the government had a lot to do with putting them in that situation, they shouldn't be paying interest because the government did it. When I went to school, I went to Caltech, and tuition, room, board, everything I spent every year was $2,000 a year. Now, it's gone up 30-fold there, and that's not all inflation. And it's gone up similarly here, and that's not all inflation. A lot of it is imposed costs from the bureaucracy. The schools are public institutions, even if they're private schools. And a lot of the things I see on campuses today, when I was a professor at UC San Diego or working at Stanford, weren't there. A lot of the costs are government-driven. And when the student can't work his way through school, we could then, because costs were low, when the student can't work his way through school and he must have an education, and the political class has caused the increase in costs, I think you should loan him money. But of course, the downside is then he has debt going out of school, and that is bad. So long run, you should get these costs down. Short run, you have to loan students, in my view, interest-free money to keep them, because they didn't cause the problem and they can't work their way through. That's a generalization. Some, of course, can afford it, but you know what the problems are.
Also, students need jobs both while they're in school and while they're out. What kinds of things would you do to ensure that there are more well-paying jobs in Oregon?
Well, new jobs are generated by the entrepreneur class. They're generated by small business for the most part. Large businesses, large corporations, if you look at statistics, don't tend to be job creators. They do their jobs and they try with efficiency to lower their staff. It's entrepreneurs and businessmen who generate, the small businesses that generate most of the jobs. And those people are having trouble. They're having trouble because of taxes and regulations. I've talked with probably hundreds and probably 1,000 of them in this district, and all of them tell the same story. The taxation in Oregon is practically the highest in the country on any kind of enterprise, and the regulations are almost the highest in the country here. So the business owner faces huge taxes, and the money he has left after that, a lot of it's wasted in unnecessary regulation. Now, we need regulation, that's not the point, but it's just gotten heavier and heavier and heavier. So we need to get these things off the backs of these entrepreneurs so that their businesses can flourish, they can expand, and they can make a place for new jobs. If we do that, we can go back to the prosperity we had. That is the main way to do it. The other way to do it, another thing that's important, is to make sure the educations are oriented toward jobs that exist. This is not so much a problem on this campus, but our junior colleges, our community colleges, need to be sure they emphasize things that put students into places, educations that are relevant. It's not as big a problem as one might think, because with a good education, you learn to think, you learn to work, you do almost anything.
Right. A popular issue right now in Oregon, as well as across the nation, is the legalization of recreational marijuana.
Yeah.
This is something that has subsequently made its way onto our ballot that people will be able to vote on this November. Where do you stand on this issue?
2 points. One is it's a state issue, and therefore, as running for Congress, it shouldn't be a concern, because the Constitution leaves it up to the states, and you see we're voting on it as a state. And it'll be an excellent exercise in federalism, because 50 states will do different things. We'll find out the best way to handle it by experiment. And that is all that running for Congress relates to. I like the fact that it's being handled as a state matter. That's what the rules say under the Constitution, and I think it'll come out well in the end. As a professional matter, I've worked my whole life in health sciences. I worry about cigarette smoking because it is a terrible health hazard. So personally, I worry about the health hazards in this, but people smoke when they want to. And so I wouldn't advise one of my sons or daughters to smoke, and I wouldn't advise them to use marijuana because I worry about the health effects of all the things we do. Linus Pauling and I started a whole program in nutrition and preventive medicine, and that's inconsistent with some of the habits that our people have. On the other hand, it's a freedom issue, and if you start to impose on liberty, it's a slippery slope.
Our nation currently seems to be paralyzed by partisan politics. What would you do to foster bipartisan solutions to the problems facing Americans?
I would go back to the time when we had citizen legislatures. I'm running for Congress. The first 100 years of our country, most congressmen served one term. The idea was they went into communities, found people who were successful and honest and relatively admired in the community. They said, we can trust you up there for 2 years, go. Sometimes they stayed 4 years. It was all a volunteer matter. In that case, you got the best ideas from the communities, and of course they made it so every 2 years you had an election for the House to keep it that way. That's what the founders intended. What we have today is a class division. We have the working class, or people like you and me, and we have a political class. And these people make careers out of politics. Once they make a career out of politics, they have a conflict of interest. Each decision is made with respect to their career and what's good for that, and if they can, for the people. This long-term career politician was not anticipated by those who set up this country. They're causing us a lot of trouble because their careers are at stake every time they make a decision. So to be seen compromising might affect my career. Or I've taken a poll and it shows me that my career is better off if I can't get along with the guy on the other side. Everybody has good ideas. I've never met an individual, a human man or woman, who didn't have a lot of abilities and knowledge I don't have. And probably I had things they didn't have. So in the case of Congress, 435 people selected from our communities and rotated often so we can get more and fresh ideas all the time, makes things work well. When you make career politicians that stay a long time, the decisions are for them, and that's what leads to this partisanship. Because if you go as a citizen volunteer, you really don't care what party you're in. See, if I go up there and I'm thinking of a career, well, they're going to pat me on the head and they'll say, no, Art, you vote with us for about 10 years and then we'll make you a poobah and then you can start to do things. If you go up there and say, I'm just going to do my best for the community for 2 to 4 years and I'm coming home, there's no lever and there's no reason why I shouldn't cooperate with everybody in the U.S. Congress. I don't care what party they're in. So you would not have the partisanship problems and all of this government inaction if they were just ordinary productive Americans who were just up there as volunteers for a couple of years, get something done and come home. There wouldn't be any of the agenda that leads to this. And it's not just one party, it's all. Occasionally get independent, but the Republicans and Democrats are both guilty of this. It freezes the governmental process and it ceases to work. We put out campaign signs, and the ones that are most popular are term limits. Now, I'm not sure, the founders gave us term limits. We can vote on these guys every 2 years, but people are so concerned about this freezing in this career politician problem, they think you make it automatic. But that's what leads to partisanship. Career politicians that stay a long time. And of course, the guy I'm running against has been there, I'm sure before you were born, since before you were born, over a quarter of a century. So he has an agenda that keeps him in office. He's clever about keeping in office. He's a little different when he's there than he is here, but that's not the point. The point is that his career is important to him, and he's protected that career, but he protects it by partisanship, just like all the rest do. He's not unique. You went to the debate last night, and you saw how he kept referring to me as a Republican. He wanted to pin on me everything the Republicans had done. This is partisanship. Actually, I'm nominated by the Constitution Party and the Republican Party. You have to be nominated by a party or you don't get enough votes to win. But this labeling and partisanship is really a product of the career idea, which was not in our minds of our founding fathers. They didn't want careers in government. They didn't really anticipate the problem we would have.
So what do you consider yourself? Do you consider yourself a Republican? Do you consider yourself an independent?
Certainly I belong to the Republican Party, probably because my family joined it in the 1850s when it was formed. Most people, or an awful lot of people, just belong to the party that they grew up in. I know and admire a lot of Democrats. I know and admire a lot of Republicans. I can say that the Republican platform is a little more like me than the other side. But if you run for office, you must choose one or the other, because there are a lot of voters that just vote with the party, and you cannot assemble 51% of the vote if you do not associate with a major party. So that's a practical matter. You can't win office unless you're one of them.
Many University of Oregon students are directly impacted by immigration. Yeah. Where do you stand on the DREAM Act and on the treatment of immigrants in this country?
Well, firstly, we must realize that these are mostly very fine people. They're seeking a better life. I see them most down at the Food for Less in Medford because I shop there around midnight. You see these three generations floating through the Hispanics mostly. And they're just looking for a better life. So they have to be treated compassionately and they have to be treated very well. At the same time, you can't have a country without a border. So we should have secure borders and a good immigration service that lets people immigrate to our country, built of immigrants, with the least difficulty. We have an inefficient immigration service and, of course, a leaky border. So people come in and they start establishing a life, but we must have rules. If we don't have rules, if we just open our borders, then our country, we can't control our resources or anything else. So I think the ones that are already here need to be treated compassionately, but I do think they need to apply for legal status here just as though they have not come in. I don't think they should just be automatically given this status in preference to those who have gone through the ordinary procedure and are waiting. But people say, does that mean they get at the back of the line? Well, the line should be short. The thing should be efficient. So these are mostly fine people. When I see those people, maybe Food for Less seems a little off the subject, but I see them there. Most of the Hispanics I see are people that look like I'd hire them. They do a hard day's work. So I think they're a credit to our country, but we must have rules, and I think we must have a secure border, and we must put everyone through the procedure, the legal procedure we establish. We need to improve that procedure so it's not so onerous.
My final question is, what would you do to address violence against women both on campus and in the home?
On the campus, it's unthinkable. I mean, I think this should be dealt with instantly and thoroughly. On this campus, your president has been lauded recently for improving this. I had two daughters that went through the university system, and of course when I went to school 50 years ago, it would be unthinkable to have the sorts of things going on today. I won't take you back to that era when we were very conservative, but there's no place in any public institution, there's no place in our society. And people come here, students come here, and I think that the university should have very strict policies, and actually, if you are strict about it and you punish people severely, you won't have much of it. And that is the best solution. I'm not talking about making an example of any one particular person, but you just have to say, there are some things totally unacceptable. You hit them hard, and the next guy won't do it. And I think you would go back to a much more benign atmosphere than we have on some of our campuses.
Well, that was my final question. Is there anything that you would like to add that you feel we haven't addressed?
Well, the three things that we've talked about, the jobs, and I think that's the most important. We didn't talk too much about education, but then education is the one the voters are most concerned about, K through 12. I've spent my life in education. I was a university professor and had a lot of students in graduate and undergraduate level. And the universities are wonderful places. I feel at home here. But I think my background would make me make good decisions. And then I think, as I mentioned, we should worry about the political process. And the founders gave us tools to fix that, and I'd like to see it fixed.
Alrighty, well thank you Mr. Robinson for joining us today. This has been both insightful and interesting.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for having me.